Hello and welcome to Reputation Matters, a show about corporate reputation, how companies face crisis, survive crisis, and what are the learnings from all of this. My guest, Mitu Samarnath, founder of Eminence Consulting, a strategy consulting firm. Mitu, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anupam.
Today we've got a very interesting topic, one that's very relevant to corporate India, succession planning. A Deloitte report of early 2024 says that over 70% of companies in India have succession planning in place, but only 27% succeed. While we believe that most challenges lie within family-owned companies, which is what succession planning probably is about, handing over from one generation to another generation. But in today's episode, these two companies are not family-owned. Both of them are professional, and they're very interesting because both of them faced a succession planning issue. The first is Infosys. The second is Axis Bank. Let's start with Infosys, the storied bellwether of Indian IT companies, the poster boy for a lot of things for middle class aspirations. What really happened out here?
Typically, Infosys, we all know and have read things about it in terms of what great things they have done, how they have got India onto the global map, and so on, right? So, all positive things we ever read and heard about the company. But this time around, it was hitting headline for the negative reasons, right? And without doubt, it'll catch attention. So, let me just step back and give you slight context of what really happened. So, since beginning, it's been run by or led by one of the founders.
Correct.
So in 2011, when Shibulal took over the reins of the company, it started seeing a couple of challenges, right? So the revenues and profits started seeing a setback. There were some senior level exits as well. And while Narayan Murthy had retired in 2011 and he had very publicly announced his retirement, he was brought in back to set things in order in 2013, if I'm not wrong. And he was brought in for about 5 years. The mandate given to him was to get the company back on track. However, while the performance improved, to some extent, but the exits continued, the attrition was a challenge. Plus, Rohan Murthy, Narayan Murthy's son, who was brought in as the EA, his entry also was
a little bit of a flutter, yeah.
Precisely. So all that, confusion was going on in the organization. During that time, Vishal Sikka was brought in from SAP. And his task was very clear. He had to strengthen the core of the company. He had to, bring back the company in the leadership position. Because during that time, Anupam, the margins margin between TCS and Infosys was actually widening. So TCS was growing much faster and Infosys wasn't really growing as fast. On the other hand, the margin with Cognizant was actually narrowing. So again, Cognizant was catching up, but Infi wasn't going that far.
And again, here the original founders of Infosys had moved out completely. So Mr. Sikka was given a complete free hand without any interference from anybody, if I recall correctly.
So that was assumed that
was the mandate.
Happen. Exactly. And hence, Mr. Narayan Murthy, while he was brought in 2013, he exited in the year 2014, as soon as Vishal Sikka joined in, so sometime around that. So clearly it was assumed that now the promoters or the founders have completely given the reins of the company to a new set of professional managers, right? And which is, again, in the textbook, the way we read, that's the ideal way to go about it.
That's how succession planning happens.
Correct. Yeah. So the expectation was that the company will again start thriving, the new infusion of energy will come in and so on. However, Vishal Sikka, he kept facing two big challenges. Number one, of course, the business environment was tough. He was trying to, like I mentioned, that there were senior level exits. So he had to rebuild the team. Then he had to claim back some of the businesses and the leadership position, like I mentioned. So all those business related challenges he had to deal with. He had to parallelly deal with public questioning of his conduct at various levels. For instance, of course, he was brought in at a very high salary and subsequently he got a very high raise as well. So his salary was somewhere around 48-50 crores in those days, which was way higher than what a TCS or a Wipro CEO was getting at that point in time. So certainly this was a matter of question for the founders who kind of grew the company in a very frugal manner. They talked about practicing simplicity and all.
Always, they were
And
known for that.
They were known for that,
Yeah.
right? So for them, at least the way Mr. Narayan Murthy brought it out, that it was not something which was the Infosys way of going
It was
about
the
it.
major change in personality of the top leadership. Going from
Precisely.
one set of thoughts to another set of thoughts, high salary, low salary, frugality, extravagance. So please, yeah, go on.
Totally. So that was one challenge, that his salary itself was questioned. Secondly, the severance package that was given to the CFO at that point in time, that was also quite handsome. And again, that came under question, that, why such a thing happened. And we all know that, it's not only Vishal Sikka who would make such a decision. So it was in tandem with the thought process of the board. But the way questioning was directed, it was directed personally on Mr. Vishal Sikka.
And of course, then there was one of the most prominent headlines at that point in time was the Panaya acquisition.
Correct.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
go on.
So that was the third challenge that he had to deal with, because there were two whistleblower complaints on Panaya acquisition, that it was not done with a complete clear corporate governance practice, which is again another cultural disconnect,
And
right?
all these three
Because
were playing out in the public eye.
Precisely. And Infosys is known, like you talked about, the fact that having simple lifestyle. Second, about high standards of corporate governance. So this episode actually was an absolute opposite of the standard perception of Infosys.
Yeah, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the corporate governance out here, because Infosys listed, I believe, in 92 or 93. And before SEBI made it mandatory as part of the listing agreement for listed companies, their level of disclosure in quarterly reports, in annual reports was stellar.
Correct.
They set the standard. And if the viewers want to just go and check out Infosys' website, they have every annual report since 1993, the time that they were listed. Okay, so if you want to know what we are talking about out here, check out those annual reports of that era and see how they had audit committees, nomination committees, all of this much before this became mandatory by SEBI for all listed companies. So they set the standard for corporate governance, not just for IT companies, for corporate India. And for them to see this, you're right. Go on, please.
Yeah. So this happened, and a lot of public outcry around this happened by Mr. Narayan Murthy, because he kept questioning that this is not the Infosys way of doing things. So much so that it went on for a few months, almost about a year, that eventually Vishal Sikka ended up resigning.
Yeah.
And in his resignation, he clearly mentioned that the primary reason of his exit is continuous personal attacks, interferences, all of that, right? So this suddenly, then conversation took a completely different direction. All experts started talking about how founders or family-owned companies do not let go of the reins of the company, even when they're outside. And Narayan Murthy, whom we all revered, we all started somewhere questioning, doubting, and thinking about it, that how come he's trying to hold on so much.
Because the interesting part is that the board backed Mr. Sikka.
Correct. Of course it did.
It's a good time for viewers to understand what exactly is the board of directors. The board of directors are an appointed body that looks after the interest of all shareholders. Now, shareholders like you, me, who probably own shares in Infosys, you could own 100 shares, I could own 10 shares, but we are shareholders of the company. We are the minority shareholders. So the board of directors acts as some kind of a buffer between the shareholders and the executive management of the company, right? So they are there to ensure that the company is run in a sensible way, in a right way, for the benefit of all shareholders.
Correct.
That is the job of the board of directors. And whenever succession planning happens or any corporate scandal happens, which you would see in a lot of episodes of this podcast, it's the board that always gets questioned. And in this case, the board backed Mr. Sikka.
Correct.
Go on.
In fact, we were talking about the Raymond's case in one of the episodes also. There also, if you recall, how independent directors called for a separate investigation. So, they do step in.
Yeah.
And they do, in fact, we'll be talking about Axis Bank there too. Board had a very interesting role. So, board was definitely backing Mr. Sikka. And when Mr. Sikka resigned, this was followed by the chairman's resignation also eventually, Mr. Seshasai. So, and then Nandan Nilekani was brought in as the non-executive chairman. So all that happened, and interestingly, Anupam, the Panaya case, under the supervision of Mr. Nandan Nilekani, it was given a complete clean chit for getting the right processes. So. Actually speaking, whether what was the problem, only two people with whom the problem happens will get to know. But when it starts coming to a public platform, unfortunately, they forget that while they are, questioning based on their personal, belief system, it's the organization that is suffering.
Always, yeah.
Right? So in this case also, the exits then will start coming in play. More importantly, clients will start doubting the organization, right? If publicly the founder of the company is questioning the organization on corporate governance practices, goes without saying that the clients will start doubting the organization, right?
So who replaced Mr. Sikka?
In the interim, COO took over the CEO role.
Yes.
However, Mr. Salil Parekh was eventually brought in, and he's been in the system since then.
Yeah.
And the organization currently again has stabilized and is growing the way it could have.
Yeah.
So that's where the whole thing is. But what really stood out for me were two very distinct observations.
Please.
Number one, that always remember that organization is way beyond individuals. And every time, senior leaders, when they forget this, that's when they start washing dirty linen in the public platform.
Yeah.
And whatever they are fighting for, which is very dear to them, the organization, actually they're damaging that organization, and hence they should be very mindful about it.
It's very interesting, right? I mean, this is a company which was known, still is known for their corporate governance, for their transparency, for their accountability, for having committees for every possible area within and beyond what is required by SEBI, and yet it went through so many, I think at least one or two crises when it came to succession planning. Yeah. Thankfully now those episodes are over. I'm pretty sure that Infosys has even learned from everything that happened.
Correct.
To their everything that happened to their leadership during the succession plan, and hopefully this will not happen again.
Totally.
Yeah. Let's go to the second case study, because that is even more interesting. It has to do with an organization that probably listed around the time as Infosys. Infosys listed, I think, in 92 or 93, and Axis Bank, then known as UTI Bank,
correct,
listed probably somewhere after that. And Axis Bank also has a very interesting succession planning issue that happened a couple of times. Let's go back in history and start from Mr. PJ Naik's term, right? Because he was the chairman and CEO, the man who turned around this organization.
Absolutely.
Let's start from there. Go on, please.
Yeah, in fact, he's credited for doing too many things for the bank, right? So it was less than 50 branches when Mr. Nayak took over, right? He grew it to 800 plus branches across city. He also initiated the international foray of Axis Bank. In fact, you and I will remember due to the US 64 crisis, etc., UTI Bank.
The name,
it was a very doubted. Correct, exactly.
It was one of the biggest. I can't recall any bank, leave alone private or public, that had such a huge makeover of their brand, changed the name. Because now you might not realize this, right? When a bank changes its name, checkbooks have to be replaced.
Totally.
Everything has to be replaced. It's very different from, a company changing its signage or their logos and stuff. This was one of the most interesting case studies in change of name and change in identity. Go on, please.
Completely. And he not just was instrumental in the name change period as well, from UTI Bank to Axis Bank. He actually grew the bank to become the third largest private bank in the country. So definitely a lot of credit went to him. And he believed that he understands the company well. According to him, he is very consciously grown leaders under him and recommended, a suitable candidate when the time for succession
came in.
Right. However, the board did not agree to that. So that's where there was a disconnect.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, Mitu, what happened was that Mr. Nayak had recommended names of internal candidates to the board.
Correct.
Remember, folks, that we said about how the board of directors is important because they approved this. So while there was a strong understanding of business particular to specialized areas of work for these internal candidates, the board thought differently. And there again, a succession planning episode happened.
Correct.
Walk us through that, please.
So the board believed that while the names that were recommended, they were definitely credible, but the names lacked, well-rounded experience. We have to understand that a CEO's role goes way beyond just the business leader's role, right? So you need to know your business right. But then there are so many other elements when you are a CEO. So you need to understand how to engage with regulators. You need to understand how to inspire employees. You need to understand how to engage with customers. And again, while we are talking about a bank, a retail bank, but its business is not just retail, right? It has a corporate banking space also. So again, engaging with customers of both scale, right? At a retail scale as well as at a corporate scale. So there were too many dimensions to a CEO that is required beyond knowing the business well or beyond knowing the industry well. So what happened, Anupam, is the board felt that while the candidates are, perfect in terms of their subject matter expertise, they were not well-rounded to be a CEO. And hence, they recommended the name of Ms. Shikha Sharma, who was the MD and CEO of ICICI Prudential Life Insurance at that point in time. Fairly well-rounded personality. As per media reports, it shows that Mr. Nayak believed that she lacks industry exposure to some extent, which I wonder how, because she was a career ICICI banker too. And in fact, she was a contender to the top role before becoming the CEO of iPru Life. So she did have good banking industry understanding. She did have a CEO role experience already. And in those days, personality to reckon with, right? So her entry was really celebrated on various counts, again, as per variety of, online, offline flow of information that was coming our way. Mr. Nayak actually, like I was saying, he proposed his internal candidate. So what happened? Board voted against his recommendation, and they preferred to go with Ms. Shikha Sharma. So then Mr. Nayak chose to resign before his term. So his term, I think, was ending somewhere in June, July. He chose to resign in the month of Jan. And that whole episode suddenly hit headline, and he kept talking about how this was not in the best interest of the organization.
So again, a boardroom drama that played out in the public eye.
Precisely.
Again, about succession planning, very much like Infosys. The incumbent has to leave, he resigned, and a lot of things came out in the public in the form of news reports, which would have at least had some impact on the bank's reputation.
Precisely.
Go on, please.
Yeah. And then when Shikha Sharma came, important point I want to bring about is during Mr. Nayak's tenure, NPAs of Axis Bank was one of the lowest. And like I said, and he was credited for many such great fundamental, changes or strengthening that he had done for the bank. When Ms. Shikha Sharma took over, the bank grew, and again, it had its own set of business ups and downs. However, conversations around NPA going up started, rising. And eventually, I think she opted for an early retirement, and she also moved out. So
that's two high-profile exits. It's PJ Nayak and Ms. Sharma.
What amazes me, or I would say what really got to my attention was the fact that once, if an organization has gone through a challenge like this, it'll learn from it, it'll invest in it to ensure that the company doesn't go through a similar kind of challenge again. However, fortunately, in this case, there was no drama with the entry of new MD and CEO. Plus, the bank is thriving right now. So, all is good for the bank, right? But if it, imagine again, if it had to go through something similar, I fail to understand, Anupam, why organizations are not consciously investing in succession planning. A big challenge is that they look at it just like an event, that whenever it will happen, we will work towards it, while it should be a continuous process.
Yeah, dekhte hain kya hota hai kind of thing. Well, there's one important point for our listeners to understand is that the difference between Infosys and Axis Bank CEOs is that the bank CEO, any bank CEO in India has to be approved by the RBI. Infosys is, of course, free to choose whoever they want, and that transition is a very different thing. But banks in India, their chairman or whatever, the top positions in the bank are usually approved by the RBI, if I've gotten that right.
Yeah.
And they go through. There have been many instances in India's banking history where the RBI has not approved the appointment of a certain CEO. In some cases, they have also put in an interim CEO when a bank goes under crisis. So for a bank to have succession planning issues in India, it's a little bit rare because these things are planned in advance.
Correct.
Getting RBI's approval and some of this happens behind the public's eye. You don't come to know that a bank has sent a certain list to the RBI or the RBI has approved so and so. But when this comes out and it plays out, and it's happened twice in case of Axis, first from Mr. Naik to Ms. Sharma, and second from Ms. Sharma to Mr. Chaudhary. So, that I think was quite interesting. And the similarity to me in both the cases was that once this crisis was put back and it was over and done with, everything went back to normal.
Correct. So organization thrives. Like I keep saying, it's something which is eternal, right? And we forget that.
Yeah.
We bring about our mortal human interest way ahead of the immortal organization,
always. Yeah.
and that's the challenge.
So let's
yeah,
go on,
and,
please,
and and one important thing is, while the second time around, Axis Bank's new CEO coming in wasn't, like I said, wasn't stormy, but the fact that it was not well planned in advance is something we need to be mindful of. And I think here I would like to take names of two organizations whose succession planning I truly admire, which is the ICICI Bank and HDFC Bank, right? Both of them, Mr. Aditya Puri was at the helm for such a long time, right? But the transition was so very smooth and the organization is not at all suffering. ICICI Bank also, succession planning from Mr. Kamath to Chanda Kochar was very, very smooth. Even Ms. Kochar's exit, while it was talked about heavily, but more importantly, Mr. Sandeep Bakshi's entry, again, it was pretty seamless and from the group companies, right? So it is important for organizations to take a slightly larger than life perspective than going by personal interest.
And even in case of Infosys, its competitors like a TCS, their succession planning was also significantly better. Mitu, let's get into the final part of our episode and talk about the key learnings from this, okay? Like, what would you say are the common lessons from both of these episodes for our listeners to take away from?
So, first and foremost, we need to remember that CEOs are in that role for a particular period of time. The exits happen. The reason of exit can be anything. It could be, unfortunately, it could even be death. It could also be choice of them moving for a better opportunity. In fact, the research report shows that average tenure of CEOs in India is 3.5 years.
Okay.
So broadly, we know that that's the kind of direction. So organizations need to really have, and here board plays a very critical role, a good succession planning framework in place. And when I say framework, and I'm not only referring to the CEO role, CEO -1, at least that role, there has to be a good shadow role parallelly running. Extremely important. In fact, couple of companies whom we advise, I have seen that play out beautifully well. So when one of the CEOs choose to move out, and it's a listed company I'm referring to, there was not even a single jerk in the organization that what happened. So that's the beauty of transition that happens.
The one thing that I'm getting from what you're saying is that grooming is important. None of this happens overnight.
Correct.
This has to start at least maybe, 1, 2, 3 years before the actual transition, the actual succession takes place.
Totally.
Yeah, go on.
So 2 key messages here. Number 1, you need to start planning in advance, and there has to be a structure or a framework for succession planning in place. Then when you're training people or grooming people, like you said, for the role, don't forget that a CEO's role or a CXO's role go way beyond knowing their business or knowing their activity, right?
What is called subject matter expertise or technical expertise.
Absolutely.
Much more than that.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a must. You can't reach this level if you don't know your subject matter. But then the plus, the essential skills, what we call, they have to be there. And if by any chance any of that is missing, organizations must invest in broad basing that.
One example of a skill that comes to my mind is consensus building within the organization. You have to be a people's person when you reach that role. What do you say about that?
So not just within the organization, right? Outside
all stakeholders,
as well. Yeah, all
stakeholders. Yeah.
And very important, you have to take people along when you take such a large role. Yes, in that one has to again be cognizant, which we are assuming that at that level they'll be cognizant that they don't get drawn into hence pleasing people.
Yeah.
It's not about pleasing people, it's about building consensus, and the 2 things are very different.
Yeah. 2 specific aspects here that I want to talk about. I want you to mention out here. First, internal versus external candidates, okay, because that's always a hot topic.
Correct.
For all, boards. And second is actually the role of the board in this. Okay,
right.
Let's start with the role of the board, because in both our examples today, both of them played a very key role. So first, the role of the board in succession planning. What do you say about that?
Extremely critical, right? And they have to ensure that it's a critical matter of NRC, the Nomination and Remuneration Committee, that the succession planning is, the whole framework is defined and the mapping is in place. If a board is not doing that, I think it's a challenge. And they have to remember it cannot be event-based. It has to be a process.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest role that the board can play. Also, board has to take another step ahead because as board members, we don't have exposure to what's exactly happening in the company. So a lot can be shown on paper or on slides, as they say. But actual reality can be different. So again, investing slightly more time and trying to get to know and engage and interact with the -1 levels to actually experience that what's on papers, what's on slide is actually in the making as well, is very critical.
My suggestion to our viewers would be that if you want to know what exactly the NRC, the Nomination and Remuneration Committee, does, specifically in terms of succession planning, please pick up an annual report. And if you're in PDF, just do a control find on succession and you'll find the philosophy out there. We are in the year 2024, not in 2004, not in 1994.
True.
Succession planning has to be mentioned as, whatever the policy is of the company will be mentioned in an annual report. And you can know the good companies which believe in corporate governance and transparency from their philosophy and framework on succession planning. It will be mentioned in the annual report.
Should be.
Let's move to internal candidate versus external candidate, because this to me is a fascinating discussion. First, there's no consensus out here.
Correct.
We have enough examples of external candidates doing really well.
Yeah.
Internal candidates also doing really well. Both the banks that you mentioned, ICICI Bank and HDFC Bank, the people who replaced the outgoing CEO have been there in the company for quite some time.
Yeah.
In ICICI Bank, Sandeep Bakshi. In case of HDFC Bank, Sachidhar Jagdishan have been around. So what's your view on this internal versus external debate?
There's no right answer. Like you rightly pointed out, that it's pretty much, either can work, either may fail, right? What is important is the cultural fit. Cultural fitment definitely needs to be evaluated. And again, that's one of the important roles of NRC to pay attention to, that the candidate which is in question, what is the cultural fitment that the candidate brings to the table. And if there is even slight disconnect in that, I would say that should be looked upon as a red flag. Whether it is a family-owned business, whether it is a professionally managed business, whether it is listed, whether it is unlisted, whatever be the size, scale, anything. But if cultural mismatch is there, definitely, it's not going to last longer. So that's the first thing organizations should pay attention to. And the second thing that they need to, pay attention to is, some homework one will have to do in advance as well, right? So what is it that you're expecting from this role? And then define, like I think Axis Bank did it right when they said that from this role, we are expecting a well-rounded professional. And if the internal candidate is not meeting that requirement, we will bring somebody from outside and then, give them the environment which is conducive for it to work. So that's also very important, having clarity in terms of what is it that you want from the candidate, because for every organization, what a tech-led organization requires in a CEO is very different from what a textile company needs from a CEO. The requirements are different. So that clarity is very critical.
Let's wrap up, Mitu. Challenges and learning. Now, when it comes to succession planning in India, there are some inbuilt, maybe challenges or hurdles or obstacles. What are they?
First and foremost, in case of family-owned businesses, and in fact, even in case of professionally run organization, people fear letting go, right? So they have their own fears in terms of what if this next person, doesn't give me the kind of, role that I'm currently playing. Predecessor is always wary of who's going to replace him or her next, because that to some extent also defines his or her role in the system. And in both organizations, whether it is family owned or professionally run, this challenge becomes very critical.
The second challenge, I believe, is how India compares in succession planning to the West, where I think it's more institutionalized. What do you think?
Yeah. It's very institutionalized. In fact, all these proxy advisory firms, etc., are also very mature in those
and active,
mature and active. You're right, in those economies, and hence the conversation around these are, very are at a different scale and a different level. However, it's not that, countries in the West, they don't have such challenges.
Enough boardroom battles there also.
We've seen that there too, right? So, so these challenges, I feel the third and the most important challenge hence is the humans' inability to process that, they are not bigger than the organization. The organizations are way bigger than them. And the day, the leadership or the board members and all of these critical decision makers in an organization, they start making decisions with organizational lens and not from the individual lens, I feel the whole succession planning outcome will be very different.
Some learnings and takeaways for our listeners to wrap up this episode, please.
3 key learnings. Number 1, don't treat succession planning as an event. It should be an ongoing process with clear mapping of roles and with clear definition of the skills and the knowledge and the expertise that you require. Learning number 2, always, go beyond your personal interest. Look at the organizational interest, and you will, be able to make decision more objectively than getting engaged into it in an emotional manner and getting into the boardroom drama and public spats. The third thing, look for cultural fitment. Anybody who's able to culturally fit into the organization will be able to build consensus with all the other stakeholders and grow the organization, which is the primary objective.
And folks, that is a wrap on this episode of Reputation Matters, where we spoke about succession planning. For more such episodes, as always, be subscribed to our channel. Mitu, thank you so much for doing this for our listeners.
Pleasure.